I'm thrilled to be joined today by Corey Washington, author and educator, to talk about his latest book, Jimi Hendrix: Black Legacy.
Thanks for having me, Brian.
I'm fascinated by your book and your work, and there's so much to talk about regarding the late great Jimi Hendrix. So let's start right at the top. Give me a summary or just an overview of what your latest book is about, please.
My latest book on Jimi Hendrix is called Jimi Hendrix: Black Legacy, A Dream Deferred. It covers his legacy in the Black community in reference to Black music, Black culture. But when you do that, you also touch on his overall legacy. So it talks about how he influenced multiple genres of music, such as jazz, even hip hop. We, of course, know blues and rock and things like that. But what I try to do with my book is go beyond the normal, go beyond what you know about Jimi and encompass it with other things that you may not have thought about Jimi. So I think that's a plus for my book.
Could you tell me how you got interested in Jimi and writing a book? Not just one book, you have two books about Jimi. Tell me what he means to you and how you got interested in his music.
It's kind of interesting because when I was first introduced to Hendrix, it was kind of a passing interest. It really wasn't anything deep because every time I would see him, it would be just in the realm of a Woodstock or Monterey. But later on, I'm watching wrestling because back then I used to be a big wrestling fan with Hulk Hogan and the NWO. He comes to the ring playing a Jimi Hendrix song, Voodoo Child. And I pick up on that. I'm like, wow, this is a sound that I've never heard before because it starts off with the wah-wah scratch. I think everybody knows that iconic sound of how Voodoo Child starts off. Mm-hmm. And so from there, I was interested and wanted to go out and see what I can get from Jimi Hendrix. So the first album I got was the blues album, which was a whole totally different direction, but it did not deter me because I felt like that was even great. So I kept going on and on and on. And finally, just started collecting all this stuff on Hendrix, all his music, watched all the videos and so forth. And so that's how I got into a deep dive on Hendrix. And then from there, when I was in college, I wanted to write a paper on Hendrix. So I wanted to tackle why was Jimi Hendrix not as appreciated as he should be in the Black community? And so from that paper, it spurred me on to my first book, Nobody Cages Me, where I was able to talk about how nobody could cage Jimi into any genre or anything like that. And then from there, went on to my second book.
Wow. Something I wanted to ask you about, I wanted to have you lend your historic perspective on how Jimi left the United States and went to England and was kind of discovered or made his mark in the British scene. And then he really blew up. And so I wanted to have you talk about that a little bit.
Well, when you talk about Jimi Hendrix and his starting off in the Chitlin circuit, which was hardcore R&B, him having to be a sideman, playing in the back of such greats as Little Richard, Wilson Pickett, there wasn't really much for him to do with the guitar. But he wanted to branch out and become his own with the instrument. And so he started in the Village, being a little more experimental. But like you said, once he was picked up by over in England, that's when things really started to explode because he was able to get with other people who were pushing the instrument, like the Jeff Becks, the Pete Townsends, and people like that. But then Jimi wanted to take it even further than that. So he took his influences that he had in the R&B Chitlin circuit, mixed it with the British rock, and then came up with his own style, and it just branched off. And so from there, he was able to come back to the United States and influence even more people. And his journey is certainly a remarkable, unique journey, and nobody can ever match that.
But why do you think that his music or his artistry hasn't been embraced as centrally a African American musician? That is it because he passed and he's stuck in time? What is your perspective on that?
I think a lot of it has to do with marketing, how you're introduced to Jimi Hendrix, because as you said, when your first introduction to him is usually as a psychedelic rock icon, Woodstock, Monterey. But, you know, a lot of people don't get introduced to him as a bluesman, he was one of the great modern bluesmen of all time. Also, he did work with R&B, but at the same time, as he started to progress in his career before he was killed in the 70s, he was starting to branch off into a funkier sound, not just with the band of Gypsies,
Right.
but listen to his later work, Straight Ahead, Dolly Dagger. I mean, that's progressive funk right there.
You know, in the wake of the murder of George Floyd and the many protests across the country that are still ongoing for Black Lives Matter, I wanted to ask you about Jimi and James Brown. You know, James Brown's well known to have done a concert in Boston after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. But what many people don't know is that Jimi also did a similar public performance that night. Can you tell me about that?
It's a part I have in my book where I write about that. James Brown and Jimi Hendrix are the only two artists known to have had concerts in the wake of Martin Luther King's assassination. Of course, like you said, James Brown was at Boston and Jimi Hendrix was in Newark at Symphony Hall. And so it's a sad state of affairs that that concert was not recorded for us in video like the James Brown concert was, because people who were in attendance in Newark said that Jimi played this hauntingly beautiful composition in honor of Martin Luther King. And just imagine that being on video. It said that people in the audience were in tears. And so that's another thing, you know, things like that that are swept under the rug, so to speak. If more people knew about that, about Jimi, I'm pretty sure it would only add to his legend and his stature.
It's true, and certainly those were difficult days in this country, and we have some of those difficult days right now, and we certainly could use some Jimi Hendrix in our lives, and I hope your book gives a nice doorway to people who want to learn a more detailed, a more nuanced look at Jimi and the great artist he was, and other ways to think about him. Again, I can't thank you enough for joining me. It's great to talk to you.
Thanks a lot, Brian.